Hey guys, tonight we plunge into a topic that's equal parts ancient, awkward, and alarmingly relatable. You're about to wander barefoot across the chilly stone floor of a Roman public latrine. Yes, a toilet, the kind with no stalls, no doors, and definitely no privacy. You'll sit elbow to elbow with toga-wearing strangers and discover just how chatty ancient bathroom breaks could be. There's no flushing handle, just gravity, flowing water, and an alarming communal sponge. You probably won't survive this, not hygienically anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are? I'd love to know. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through a Roman town, not a Hollywood version with blazing torches and gladiators, but a very real, very lived-in place. The streets smell faintly of olive oil, baked bread, and something else, something murky. You follow a trail of slippery paving stones, step past a bakery, and arrive at a long, low building with an open doorway. No sign, no fancy inscription, just the unmistakable stench of human civilization. Congratulations! You've arrived at the communal toilet. Inside, it's dim. Natural light filters in from high barred windows. Lining each wall are stone benches with oval holes cut evenly into them, like a polite row of hungry mouths. There's no partition, no privacy. You're meant to sit beside your neighbors, like you're in some weird, bottomless amphitheater. Underneath those benches runs a steady channel of water, fresh from the aqueducts, which carries away the waste. It's a simple but brilliant design. You sit, you do your business, gravity does the rest. And yes, Romans were clever enough to place a separate water stream just in front of your feet, for cleaning your sponge on a stick. But we'll get to that delightful detail later. For now, you shuffle toward a hole, nervously glance at your neighbors, and lower yourself onto the cool, worn stone. You're suddenly very aware that there's no toilet paper, no privacy, and everyone else seems incredibly comfortable. One man is humming, another is eating grapes. A third one is loudly retelling a story about his cousin who slipped and fell in the latrine trench. You are the only one here who looks tense. To the Romans, public toilets weren't shameful. They were routine, even social. You might hear gossip about senators, trade prices for fish, or receive advice on which goddess to pray to for better digestion. And they were everywhere. Cities like Ostia and Pompeii had dozens of public latrines. Wealthier neighborhoods had more lavish versions, with tiled mosaics and marble seating. But even the basic ones, like this one you're in now, had two vital things: running water and communal vibes. Don't be surprised if someone sits beside you and strikes up a conversation. You might get asked about your tunic fabric, or what you had for breakfast, or if you believe in sewer spirits. That last one sounds weird now, but back then, perfectly ordinary conversation. Historians still argue whether there was a certain etiquette, like skip a seat between strangers, or whether people simply plopped down wherever. Some latrines had armrests carved between holes, others didn't. And the archaeological record is too inconsistent to settle it once and for all. So, for now, just sit tight and hope your neighbor isn't a seat hogger. The air is thick with smells, damp stone, vinegary sponges, and the unmistakable tang of what one Roman writer politely called natural functions. But if you ignore the olfactory assault, there's a beauty to this setup. Everything works together. Water in, waste out, community around you. And it was free. No one charged you to sit here, at least not yet. One curious detail, there's often a hole at the front of the bench, too, between your legs. That's for the cleaning sponge, of course. But again, let's save that joy for Section 2. For now, look down. Beneath the bench, you see the wastewater flowing, slowly, deliberately, carried away to the main sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, one of the greatest feats of Roman engineering. But more on that later. As you sit, a woman walks past the doorway. She glances in but doesn't enter. Roman public toilets were often built for men only. Women had fewer options. Sometimes they shared these spaces, sometimes not. Historians still debate this too, but the male-centric design is unmistakable. Fewer female facilities, fewer female depictions in art. Yet they still had to go somewhere, didn't they? Back in the latrine, someone cracks a joke. Something about figs, wine, and what happens the next morning. Everyone laughs. You do too, nervously. But it's working. You're blending in. You're now part of a very ancient ritual, not glamorous, not heroic, but deeply, unforgettably human. So sit back, well, not too far, and prepare yourself, because this toilet, it's just the beginning. The moment you shift on the stone seat, you realize something's missing. There's no little white roll conveniently mounted on the wall, no stack of folded paper waiting in a basket. What Romans used instead. That's about to redefine your standards for clean. Just below eye level, set neatly into a groove along the edge of the bench, sits a long wooden stick. At the end, a porous grayish mass. Sponge. It's damp. It's shared. And it's for your behind. Introducing the tersorium, or, as it's affectionately known in modern reenactor circles, the sponge on a stick. It's communal. It's used for wiping. And you don't even get your own. You probably don't want to ask how many people used it before you today. You grab it hesitantly. It's slick with something acidic. Vinegar water, probably. Romans believed vinegar disinfected, and to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. It did help, sort of. But the problem wasn't the idea. It was the execution. After wiping, you'd rinse it off in the channel of flowing water near your feet. squeeze it out, and return it to the groove for the next user. Yes, that's how it worked. It's a rotation system with horrifying efficiency. Some historians argue whether each person might have had their own personal sponge, carried in a pouch perhaps, but the evidence mostly points to communal use. One sponge, many butts, minimal drama. The Romans, masters of practicality, not necessarily of comfort. The vinegar rinse was one defense, but users also sometimes added salt water or even ash. Some thought that ash neutralized bad humors. Others believed the salt kept away demons. It's hard to say where hygiene stopped and superstition began. And this sponge, porous, heavy, and organic, wasn't indestructible. It would degrade, get smelly, go missing, occasionally clog drains. Imagine being the unlucky servant tasked with replacing it. Now, you might be wondering, did people ever get sick from this system? Oh yes. Enter the Roman parasite problem. Archaeologists examining ancient latrine sediments have uncovered a delightful variety of intestinal parasites. Whipworms, roundworms, pinworms, the whole itchy ensemble. The sponge system didn't help. It might even have helped them spread. But if you suggested that to a Roman, they'd shrug. Everyone's got worms, which, disturbingly, was mostly true. Still, the Romans weren't entirely oblivious. In some high-end homes, sponges were replaced with wool cloths, sometimes scented. And wealthy homes often had their own toilet systems, with plumbing and privacy. But for the average Roman on the street, the sponge ruled. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal, possibly horrifyingly true, about a Roman philosopher who committed suicide by shoving a sponge on a stick down his own throat. An act of despair, perhaps, or just an extreme protest against bad hygiene. Another quirky twist, there's a theory, still debated, that some people used broken pottery shards for wiping. These pessoi, usually reused bits of smashed pots, were sometimes inscribed with names, political enemies, ex-lovers, or unfortunate neighbors. It was a strange blend of spite and sanitation, a scholar's form of bathroom graffiti. Historians still argue whether these shards were genuinely used for wiping or simply symbolic objects discarded in toilets. But the image of wiping with pottery is hard to unsee once planted in your mind. And once again, welcome to the wonders of Roman hygiene. It gets better. Well, worse, actually. There's some evidence to suggest that specific public toilets were known to cause outbreaks of disease more than others. Certain latrines may have been avoided entirely. Folks chose their loo like you'd choose a safe lunch spot. You go where your friend didn't catch dysentery last week. One early Christian writer even used the tersorium as a metaphor for moral corruption. Think about that. A sponge on a stick was such a powerful symbol of shared sinful decay that it made its way into moral sermons. And just when you think the Romans couldn't make the experience any more intimate, they also didn't wash their hands after. Soap wasn't a staple yet. Oil and scraping were the go-to cleaning method for the body, but not necessarily post-potty routines. Some used sand, others nothing at all. But oddly, despite all of this, the Romans were seen by many ancient cultures as unusually clean. Their love of baths, their careful sewer systems, their methodical street cleaning, all of it suggested a civilization obsessed with order and purification. They just had a blind spot when it came to what happened once you sat on the bench. Still holding that sponge? You might want to put it down now. Gently. Maybe with tongs. And if you thought that was bad, just wait until we explore what else went on in these latrines, political deals, curses, and musical flatulence contests. No joke. The sponge, in its own way, says everything about Roman practicality. It worked. It was simple. It was cheap. And for over 1,000 years, it held its place as the supreme bottom-wiping technology of an empire. That is, until something better came along, centuries later. But for now, back in this Roman latrine, you're left with vinegar fingers and a newfound appreciation for modern plumbing. As your eyes adjust to the gloom and your sense of dignity slowly evaporates, something strange begins to dawn on you. These Roman toilets? They're not quiet. In fact, they're oddly lively. To your left, two older men are deep in discussion about olive oil prices. To your right, someone's whistling. A teenager is telling a story involving a goat, a wine jug, and what sounds like a regrettable festival accident. No one seems bothered that they're seated over open waste channels with their tunics hiked up. In fact, the vibe is downright casual. This isn't just a place for doing your business. This is where Romans did business. You've just stepped into what might be the world's least glamorous social club. Roman latrines weren't just about sanitation, they were about conversation. Picture it, a row of citizens sitting elbow to elbow, sharing not just a sponge, but opinions, rumors, even bits of poetry. If you think chatting in the office bathroom is awkward, imagine pitching your new wine import venture while the guy next to you is audibly struggling with last night's lentils. But here, it worked. It was expected. In fact, silence would have been weirder. Historians still argue whether this social aspect was intentional or just a side effect of necessity. But the layout of many latrines, semicircular benches facing each other, suggests these places were designed for group use, even interaction. There's a sort of weird intimacy to it. Eye contact was possible, encouraged even. We have evidence of politicians striking up conversations in public toilets. Slaves reported overhearing key details while crouched nearby. In fact, some historians suggest that Roman toilets were a kind of democratic equalizer. Patrician or plebeian, everyone had to squat. And once squatting, everyone could talk. That said, etiquette still mattered. Just as modern folks have unspoken bathroom codes, like avoiding the urinal right next to someone, Romans likely had social rules too. Maybe don't interrupt a man mid-grimace. Maybe don't bring olives as a snack. These rules weren't written down, but they were lived. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered graffiti near a latrine reading Apollinaris, the doctor of the emperor, defecated well here. Another reads, Secundus defecated here. It's almost sweet, like signing a guest book. If the guest book were in a sewer and everyone signed it mid-poop. Graffiti was a big deal in latrines. You'd find insults, love notes, crude sketches, and philosophical musings. Some people even carved riddles into the walls. What's long, wet, and disappears down a hole? You get the idea. And not just walls. Columns and even doorways bore inscriptions. These weren't random scribbles. They were slices of everyday Roman humor and frustration. One especially memorable scrawl reads, "The man who wrote this is a fool." Self-aware, even in the loo. Sometimes a little flute music floated through the open windows, not an uncommon addition. Musicians, often slaves or lower-class performers, might wander public spaces to play soft tunes. Imagine it. A bit of background music while you work things out. Public latrines also hosted moments of surprising tenderness. A traveler far from home might chat with a local about homesickness. An old man might teach a child the technique of sponge use with grandfatherly care. You can laugh, but there's something heartwarming about that. And yes, there were jokes. Juvenal, a Roman poet, made fun of people who spent too much time in the toilet. Martial, ever the snarky wit, mocked friends for thinking too hard while seated. Even Emperor Hadrian reportedly cracked jokes during his visits. Don't get the wrong idea, though. These weren't always pleasant spaces. The smell was formidable, and without ventilation, it lingered. Plus, the constant moisture meant moss grew on the stone floors. Slipping wasn't rare, and bruised tailbones were practically a rite of passage. Yet Romans came back, day after day. Why? Because the toilet wasn't just where you went. It was where you were. It was where you talked, laughed, eavesdropped, learned the news, and felt part of the city's rhythm. Some upper-class Romans even brought servants along to act as seat warmers or to hold conversation. The absurdity of this hasn't been lost on scholars. Imagine being paid to warm someone's toilet stone with your backside, or worse, being the backup sponge boy. In bigger cities like Rome or Ostia, latrines near marketplaces became hot spots of chatter. Imagine them like Roman cafes, just significantly smellier. Of course, not everyone loved the social element. Some writings from more reclusive thinkers like the Stoics hinted at disdain for public lavatory culture. One grumpy writer called it the buzzing den of foul philosophers. But for most Romans, it was part of life, a place to relieve both bowels and burdens, where words flowed almost as freely as, well, you get it. You finish your business, rinse your hands in the trickle of water provided, and step back out into the sunlight. The man beside you calls out a parting joke. May your stomach always move as freely as your tongue. You offer a tired chuckle, and somewhere in the distance, a group of boys is arguing over who has the best poop joke. Some things truly never change. You're back outside in the Roman sun now, but your curiosity drags you toward the source of that trickling sound beneath the latrine. You glance down at a narrow, stone-lined channel where water still flows steadily along its carved path. Cool, clear, and unmistakably part of something bigger. You're standing on top of an empire-wide feat of engineering genius, the Roman sanitation system. And right now, we're diving, figuratively, thankfully, into the plumbing beneath your feet. It all starts with the aqueducts, those grand arched stone bridges that snaked across hillsides, bringing fresh water from mountain springs into cities. You've seen them in tourist brochures and gladiator montages, but their quiet power lies not in their beauty, it's in their gradient. The water flowed thanks to gravity alone. No pumps, no motors, just meticulous planning, a constant gentle slope, and a stubborn refusal to accept dry bathtubs. Once that water reached the city, it split into different channels. Some fed public fountains, others supplied bathhouses, and a crucial portion was diverted to latrines. Roman toilets weren't standalone pits. They were integrated into this hydrological ballet. The constant stream beneath each latrine bench carried waste away to the sewers. The crown jewel of this underworld was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. Built in the 6th century BCE and improved over generations, it ran like a spinal cord beneath Rome, collecting waste and rainwater and funneling it out into the Tiber River. You'd never guess you were standing atop what was for centuries one of the largest covered sewers in the world. In fact, some of it still flows today. And the design, incredibly durable. Vaulted ceilings, sturdy stone lining, access tunnels. It was more stable than many modern basements. Roman engineers even built inspection shafts for maintenance, long before a plumber became a profession. Historians still argue whether the Cloaca Maxima was built solely for sewage, or also as a way to prevent flooding. But it's likely both. Rome's early king weren't about to let their forum turn into a swamp. And so they created a marvel that would shape urban sanitation for millennia. And not just in Rome. Every Roman colony, whether in Spain, Gaul, or North Africa, came with a sewer system, or at least a plan for one. It was part of the Roman identity, to build, to organize, to flush. Of course, not all systems were created equal. Wealthy districts got better water flow. Poorer ones dealt with sluggish streams, backups, and the occasional surprise rat. Yes, rats. Roman sewers were cozy habitats for all sorts of creatures. Pliny the Elder once described giant sewer rats that could climb up through the pipes. And in Pompeii, several latrine skeletons show signs of being bitten by rodents, most likely when seated. Charming. Now, about flushing. There was no handle, no dramatic swoosh. The system was continuous. Water flowed constantly, pulled by gravity from aqueduct-fed cisterns above the latrine. Waste dropped down, was caught in the channel, and drifted along slowly but steadily toward the main sewer. In smaller homes, it was more basic. A pot might be dumped into a gutter. Wealthier homes had underfloor channels with pipework. Some even had rudimentary flushing basins. Pour water in after you go, like a very slow manual bidet. But the scale of it all? Astonishing. Estimates suggest Rome consumed up to 1,000 liters of water per person per day. That's more than modern cities in some cases. And while not all of it went to toilets, a lot of it went toward public health. Even when Romans didn't fully understand germs, they knew stagnation was bad. Moving water was healthy. Flow was life. Still, all that water had to come from somewhere. During dry seasons, aqueducts ran low and flushing slowed. Latrines backed up. Sewer smells intensified. In desperation, citizens might pour amphoras of bathwater down the drains to keep things moving. Sometimes, though, the system just failed. Pipes collapsed, sediment built up, and when sewers flooded, it wasn't just rainwater that overflowed. Entire neighborhoods could reek for weeks. There's an account of one senator refusing to leave his domus for a month after a sewer burst near the Forum. This is where the Foricariae come in, the unsung heroes of Roman sanitation. These were the workers who maintained the sewers, cleaned blockages, and braved the literal underworld. Armed with hooks, torches, and a level of tolerance that defies belief, they were the ancient equivalent of utility workers, minus the union breaks. Their job was dangerous. Toxic gases built up in the tunnels. Collapses weren't uncommon. And oh yes, occasionally people used sewers for, let's say, storage. Everything from discarded idols to unwanted infants has been recovered from Roman sewers. But we're drifting into darker territory. Let's paddle back to that gentle flow under the latrine bench. You peer into the water. It gurgles calmly. Maybe it stinks, maybe it doesn't. Depends on the neighborhood, but one thing's for sure. This system is keeping your city from becoming a disease-ridden swamp. It's one of those quiet triumphs of civilization. No marble statue, no golden inscription, just clean water flowing, waste moving, and the soft burble of an empire that knew on some level that keeping things moving meant keeping people alive. So the next time your toilet flushes a little too slowly and you feel a flicker of modern frustration, just remember, the Romans had gravity, rats, and vinegar sponges. You'll be fine. You stroll away from the latrine, eager to find cleaner air, but something on the wall catches your eye. Tucked between faded frescoes and chipped plaster is a small niche, half hidden in shadow. Inside it, a little statue worn smooth with time. Not a heroic god or glistening athlete, but a modest figure crowned with a sewer grate. Meet Cloacina, goddess of the sewers. Yes, even Roman waste management had divine representation. and you thought your job lacked glamour. Cloacina was the patron spirit of the Cloaca Maxima itself. Her name, derived from the Latin cloaca, literally means purifier, which may be the most elegant spin on sewer work in history. According to Roman tradition, she started out as an Etruscan water deity, gentle, maternal, and vaguely connected to cleanliness. But as Rome's sewers expanded, she evolved into the spirit that watched over their vast, dark underworld. It's like if your modern city had a goddess of the storm drain who also handled all customer complaints. And she wasn't some forgotten rural deity either. A tiny shrine to Cloacina stood right in the Roman Forum. Archaeological remains show it was circular, marble, and perched near the entrance to one of the great sewer vents. A vent so grand it became a sightseeing stop. Writers like Livy and Pliny mention her. Even coins were minted with her image, usually showing her standing demurely, cloaked, holding flowers and perhaps a symbol of purification. It's strange, isn't it? In a culture obsessed with gods of war, wine, and love, there was also space for a goddess of what happens after all that partying. You begin to notice Rome had a god or goddess for nearly every bodily function: Febris for fevers, Mephitis for foul smells, Crepitus, possibly apocryphal, for flatulence. Some say Crepitus wasn't worshipped seriously, but even the joke suggests that ancient people gave thought to every rumble and release of the body. The divine was present even in discomfort. Historians still argue whether Cloacina was a real goddess with temples and priests, or more of a symbolic presence, an old deity adopted for convenience. But her longevity speaks volumes. Her shrine was maintained for centuries, and her presence invoked when things went wrong beneath the city. When the Cloaca Maxima flooded or backed up, it wasn't just an engineering failure, it was an omen. Offerings were made, prayers whispered, sometimes chickens sacrificed. Other times, small silver tokens were tossed into the sewers as appeasement. People believed that spirits could dwell in the dark, wet places below their feet. Cloacina kept them calm. She watched over the delicate flow between civilization and filth. And in a world without antibiotics, keeping divine favor was more than ritual. It was survival. Of course, not every Roman believed equally. Some scoffed at the idea. The Stoics, always skeptical, preferred reason over rituals. They saw blocked drains as a plumbing issue, not divine punishment. But even the skeptics rarely mocked Cloacina outright. You didn't make jokes about the spirit who managed your sewage. And then there were the magical wards. Tucked into corners of latrines, archaeologists have found lead-cursed tablets, tiny figurines, and carved talismans. Some asked Cloacina to protect against backflow. Others warned off demons. One tablet from a latrine in Antioch reads roughly, "If the spirits rise, may they choke on the filth they bring." Comforting. You look around again, and now that you're tuned in, you spot her image more often, on mosaics, carved into fountain basins, scratched into the plaster of alleyways near sewer grates, a quiet, constant presence. There's something oddly poetic about her. Cloacina stood as the guardian of thresholds, not doors, but exits. She oversaw what left the body, the house, the city. In a culture that prized order, she embodied the last step of cleanliness. And perhaps more than that, she was a reminder that even the most mundane parts of life deserved respect. You might be an emperor, a slave, a baker, or a soldier, but when nature called, you all relied on the same divine plumbing supervisor. Some ancient writers connected Cloacina with Venus. Yes, the goddess of love. That seems like a strange pairing until you consider how Romans loved symbolic blending. Venus Cloacina may have represented purification after romantic encounters, or maybe it was just bureaucratic pantheon filing. Either way, that's one goddess with quite the resume. Eventually, as Christianity took root in the empire, Cloacina faded. Sewer maintenance became a civic duty rather than a spiritual one. Her shrine was buried, her name forgotten, until archaeologists dug her up again. But in her time, she mattered. She watched from her little marble pedestal while millions lived and died above her, never knowing how close they came to disaster every time the sewers ran slow. You walk on, the sun warm on your back, and can't help but smile. Somewhere down there, Cloacina's spirit still flows with the water, quiet, tireless, and probably underappreciated. You're passing another row of public latrines now, but this one feels different. Busier, louder, almost theatrical. You lean in and notice something unexpected scratched into the plaster. Lines of verse, names, threats, and declarations of bathroom pride. Welcome to the chaotic world of toilet graffiti, Rome's most unfiltered social media feed. The walls of Roman latrines were more than bare surfaces. They were living scrolls. Citizens wrote, scratched, and occasionally painted their thoughts directly above the place where they relieved themselves. Imagine updating your status while updating your... Well, you get it. The graffiti ranged from crude jokes to surprisingly heartfelt messages. Some were warnings. Beware of the sponge thief. Others were philosophical. Fortune passes like this wind. And some, pure bathroom humor. I have relieved myself. Now you may do the same. Farewell. One latrine in Pompeii featured a particularly bold scrawl. Secundus defecated here. Just that. No embellishment. A proud, eternal mark left by someone who wanted to be remembered, not for his poetry or politics, but for a solid bowel movement. And don't assume this was limited to the lower classes. Elite Romans could be just as potty-mouthed, literally. Martial, the poet famed for his sharp tongue, once compared a rival's poetry to something you'd find in a latrine. Juvenal roasted entire social classes with scatological metaphors. It wasn't just humor, though. Some inscriptions were seriously serious. you'd find curses written on lead tablets and nailed near toilet entrances. One fragment reads, "May whoever stole my cloak suffer eternal blockage," a creative take on justice. Historians still argue whether most latrine graffiti was spontaneous or ritualistic. Was it just bored citizens scratching in the dark, or was this a kind of performance, a deliberate act of marking space, claiming momentary fame in a world where most voices went unheard? There's also the question of why so much of it was found in latrines. After all, Roman cities had walls, bathhouses, and temples, but toilet graffiti is especially plentiful. One theory, because it was safe. What better place to be anonymous than in a room where everyone's already pretending not to notice each other? Others argue it was because latrines were full of downtime. You sit, you wait, your hands are idle. The wall is right there. You scratch something in with your stylus or a sharp pebble, and boom, instant legacy. Some of the inscriptions are surprisingly affectionate. One reads, "Lucia, may your stool always pass smoothly." That's love. Roman love. Others are more competitive. Archaeologists found multiple versions of "I was here first," which, let's be honest, is the eternal human urge, claiming credit even in the most unsavory places. One fascinating subset of graffiti includes little riddles and jokes that only make sense in the latrine context, like, "What's brown moves quickly and rules the world. Your fear when you sit too late." You can practically hear the chuckles echoing off the tile, and yes, some were offensive, some racist, some deeply misogynistic. It wasn't all charm and clever wordplay. The ancient world was still the ancient world, full of power imbalances and unchecked egos. Latrine walls offered a free platform with no moderation. Sound familiar? But then there's the poetry. Bad poetry mostly, but endearing. Odes to lovers, laments about indigestion, tiny verses written in hexameter, even if they rhymed more in intent than in meter. One reads, "In this place I let go of pain, not from love, but from lentils." That's haiku-level genius. Then there's the unexpected beauty. Drawings of ships, birds, gladiators, and even gods, all carved into walls by people with time, patience, and nowhere else to go. These crude sketches are, in a strange way, deeply human. Someone, sometime, sat down with a stick and decided to create something, to leave a mark. Over time, these marks built up, layers upon layers of graffiti, some carved over older messages. It creates a kind of conversation across generations. One person writes, "Gaius smells." 2 years later, someone adds, "No worse than Marcus." And so it goes. In some latrines, you find walls so covered that it's hard to see the stone beneath. It's like a chaotic mosaic of thoughts, jokes, and petty rivalries. A museum of ancient minds at their most unguarded. Modern archaeologists painstakingly copy these inscriptions into databases. Some are preserved in textbooks, some in digital archives, but most remain exactly where they were scratched, on cold stone under centuries of dust, just waiting to be read again. You imagine someone, maybe a baker, maybe a soldier, sitting there, thinking, pausing, then leaning forward to scratch 5 words. The gods can't smell this. A little joke, a quiet protest, a moment of humanity. So the next time you find yourself in a restroom stall with a Sharpie and an idea, remember, you're part of a very, very old tradition. Maybe don't follow through, but at least know that Secundus would have been proud. You turn a corner and find a small stone alcove, not unlike the others. But this one has a man seated outside with a little tray of tokens. He jingles them as you approach, looking both bored and mildly hopeful. This isn't just any latrine. This one's pay to poo. Yes, even in ancient Rome, capitalism crept into the most private parts of life. This is a forica privata, a privately operated public toilet. Instead of just walking in and sitting down, you first hand over a token. In return, you're granted entry to one of the stalls, possibly even one with a clean sponge. Luxury. These tokens, known as spintriae, were made of bronze or brass, and often bore curious imagery, numbers, inscriptions, and sometimes even little erotic scenes that, quite frankly, no one asked for while waiting in line for the toilet. Historians still argue whether these erotic images had anything to do with brothels, or whether they were simply denominations in a numbered system. Either way, they were not currency, only used for specific purposes, like gaining access to bathhouses or toilets. In a way, it was a kind of ancient punch card. You hand over the token, and down the hall you go. But where did this idea come from? Enter Vespasian. Yes, Emperor Vespasian, father of the Colosseum and patron saint of not letting a single drop of urine go untaxed. When he rose to power in the wake of Rome's devastating civil wars, the imperial coffers were nearly empty. So he did what any savvy leader would do. He looked for new things to tax. One of those things? Urine. In Rome, urine wasn't just waste. It was a valuable commodity. It contained ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent. Fullers, the launderers of Rome, collected it in jars and used it to wash dirty togas. Leather workers softened hides with it. Tanneries practically marinated in the stuff. So, when Vespasian imposed a tax on public urine collection, people balked. Seriously? A pee tax? Yes, a pee tax, officially called the vectigal urinae. When his son Titus complained about the unsavory nature of the revenue, Vespasian supposedly held a coin up to his nose and declared, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't stink. That phrase is still used today. You've probably heard it before, without realizing it originated from ancient latrine politics. The tax didn't mean everyone had to pay to relieve themselves, but collectors of urine did. They gathered it from public urinals or jars placed in alleyways, and paid the state for the right to harvest what others left behind. Some modern historians compare it to waste management licensing. You pay for the right to clean up and resell what's left behind. Except in this case, what's left behind was warm, yellow, and bubbling with ammonia. Meanwhile, the paid latrines, like the one you're standing beside now, were private ventures. A wealthy entrepreneur would build a facility, maintain the sewer connections, and charge customers for access. It wasn't unlike a gas station restroom with a keypad, except with sponges. And as unglamorous as the business model sounds, it worked. In fact, Vespasian's name became so associated with public urination that in France today, coin-operated public toilets are still called Vespasiennes, a strange but lasting imperial legacy. You hand the token to the attendant and step inside. This latrine is slightly nicer than the free ones. Less graffiti, smoother stone, and yes, the sponge appears freshly rinsed. There's even a little oil lamp set into a niche, casting flickering shadows across the floor. Someone in the next stall is humming. Another is tapping their foot. The scent is still present. No miracle of urban planning can fully disguise it. But there's a faint trace of lavender. Maybe someone brought sachets. Or maybe it's the lemony ashes from a recent sponge rinse. Even here, though, the system is the same. Water flows, waste drops, the sponge sits ready, and somewhere outside, a fuller waits for his next jar of golden liquid. Because while you might be horrified at the thought of people collecting urine for a living, the Romans were practical. To them, nothing was truly waste if it could be used. They were, in a strange way, ahead of their time, recycling, repurposing, and taxing with ruthless efficiency. And like with everything else in Rome, class mattered. The rich had indoor facilities with marble and mosaics. The poor made do with chamber pots and alleyways, but the fullers, they served everyone equally and profited handsomely from what others left behind. You finish your business, return the sponge, and step outside. The attendant waves and you think for a second, should I tip? You decide against it, but you do toss a small coin into the public fountain nearby, just in case Cloacina is watching. And as you walk away, the jingle of tokens continues behind you, a reminder that even in the heart of an empire, nothing came for free, not even a moment of relief. The day is getting hotter now. Roman streets shimmer in the midday sun, and the scent of baked bread mingles with something far less appetizing, wafting from a nearby alley. You wrinkle your nose. It's not the latrines this time. It's the chamber pots. Because while Rome had public toilets, many people, especially women and the poor, couldn't or didn't use them. So what did they do? They used porta-potties, Roman style. Only theirs weren't blue plastic booths. They were ceramic pots, and they didn't stay inside. These were called maculae, and they were the Roman solution for indoor relief. In wealthier homes, you might find a chamber pot tucked under the bed or in a little niche. In poorer homes or shared tenements called insula, a simple bucket might suffice. Once full, the contents were disposed of with varying degrees of care. Ideally, someone, usually a servant or hired boy, would empty the pot into a local gutter, which would carry the waste into the sewer system. But ideally is doing a lot of work there, because in reality, a disturbingly common method was to toss it out the window. Just lean out, dump, and hope no one was walking below. Hence the famous Roman custom of shouting a warning before emptying one's matula onto the street. The Latin equivalent of heads up was sometimes followed by a more specific, if grim, warning. Cava tibi, ex urina pluit. Watch out, it's raining pee. You walk through a narrow alley now, looking up nervously at the overhanging balconies. Most are shuttered, but one or two have suspiciously stained tiles. It's hard not to pick up your pace. Roman law tried to discourage this. In fact, there were rules. If you dumped a pot out the window and hit someone, you could be fined. If you killed someone, you could be charged with manslaughter. The 2nd century jurist Ulpian even wrote about a case where a man was knocked unconscious by a falling chamber pot. He sued. He won. Still, the practice persisted, especially in crowded neighborhoods with no plumbing. If you lived 5 stories up and your pot was full, you weren't climbing down and back up every time. You made do. You improvised. You aimed carefully. Historians still argue whether this practice was common or exaggerated in later writings. But archaeological evidence, stains on walls, drainage pathways, and blocked gutter channels suggests it happened often enough to leave a mark. Literally. Women in particular faced unique challenges. While there's some debate over whether public latrines were gender segregated, it's generally agreed that women had fewer options. Modesty, safety, and distance made public facilities harder to access. So women relied on chamber pots and ingenuity. One fascinating artifact is the female urinal funnel, a curved pottery tool shaped to allow women to relieve themselves while standing or squatting discreetly. Think of it as an ancient shiwi. These devices were especially common in households or when traveling. Women might also use cloth wraps to muffle sound or go in pairs for protection. Privacy was rare, but dignity was fiercely preserved. And children? They often went anywhere. A quiet gutter, a hidden stairwell, even corners of bathhouses were occasionally repurposed. Some bathhouse attendants reportedly carried water not just for washing, but for rinsing little accidents off the tiles. Of course, not all chamber pot waste was randomly dumped. Enter the Fullers again, our old urine collectors. They placed jars along roadsides where passers-by could relieve themselves. These jars, amphoras sunk into the ground or wall niches, acted like urinals. You'd think people might be embarrassed to use them, but Romans were remarkably casual about bodily functions. If it served a purpose, it was acceptable. Besides, you were helping someone clean a toga. That was civic duty. Back inside the tenements, poorer families might share one pot per floor. In the absence of pipes, creative waste management became a daily chore. You start to wonder if the smell was ever not there. Maybe your nose just stopped noticing. One amusing record survives of a landlord who advertised improved waste buckets in his rental listings. Supposedly leak-proof, probably not. And yet, even with all the inconvenience, there's something oddly admirable about how they managed. With no rubber gloves, no Lysol, no scented candles, the Romans still kept their cities mostly functional. Yes, they had sewer rats, parasitic worms, and flying chamber pots, but also water systems, legal codes, and even a goddess overseeing it all. Still, it makes you think twice about staying in a third-floor apartment. You stop at a corner where a young boy is scrubbing the gutter with a bucket of soapy water. His mother scolds him from a doorway, waving a sandal. A full pot sits nearby, lid askew. The boy grumbles, but keeps working. That right there? Ancient sanitation at work. Not glamorous, not heroic, but the reason streets weren't completely unbearable. And remember, if a Roman invited you over for dinner, you might sit just a few feet from the household latrine, cleverly hidden behind a curtain. Chamber pots sometimes doubled as stools with removable lids. Think Ottoman, but cursed. So next time you're tempted to complain about your bathroom's water pressure, think back to those winding alleys, the sloshing maculae, and the eternal risk of overhead drizzle. And maybe, just maybe, carry an umbrella. You've made it this far without stepping in anything regrettable. Congratulations. But don't relax just yet, because now we're stepping into one of the noisiest, smelliest, and oddly most beloved locations in Roman society, the public bathhouse. At first glance, the baths don't seem connected to toilets or latrines. They're for getting clean, not the opposite. But the overlap is stronger than you'd think, and more than a few Romans used them for both. Inside, the air is thick with steam and the scent of olive oil soap. Men walk casually in and out of changing rooms, some in tunics, some in nothing at all, chatting about politics, horse races, and who got too drunk at last night's feast. Slaves scurry around with buckets and towels, and in a corner a man is getting scraped down with a curved metal tool, the strigil, used to remove sweat and oil from the skin. But before anyone gets in the water, there's usually one stop to make: the bathhouse latrine. And unlike the Spartan public latrines scattered around the city, these facilities are a little more refined. You might find marble seats, mosaic floors, and maybe even a mural or two. If you're lucky, there's music from a nearby lyre player to set the mood. Still the same deal, though. Sponge on a stick, shared, vinegar rinse, minimal privacy. But here, you're with your fellow bathers, so there's less awkwardness, more routine. The real difference is the location. These latrines were integrated into the bath's infrastructure, often positioned near the apoditerium, changing area, or the palestra, exercise yard. Think of it as a pit stop between lifting weights and lounging in the sauna. Why the prime location? Because once you entered the baths, you were there for hours. This wasn't just a rinse, it was your social calendar. Sooner or later, nature called. Historians still argue whether bathhouse toilets were open to all or reserved for paying customers. Some bath complexes had separate paid tiers, so the fancier the bath, the fancier the facilities. And just like the latrines around the Forum, these too had their own quirks. For instance, some bathhouse toilets had no partitions at all, but were arranged in elegant circles or semicircles, encouraging, well, conversation. That's right. You could relieve yourself while discussing gladiator stats or debating Cicero's latest speech. There are even ancient graffiti scribbled inside bathhouse stalls, poking fun at bathers who took too long or who, let's just say, made too much noise. One reads, "Gaius makes sounds like a trumpet, but still leaves nothing behind." A kind of ancient Yelp review, but for bathroom performance. Then there's the matter of hygiene. Ironically, the bathhouses, meant to cleanse, were also prime spots for spreading disease. Foot fungus, eye infections, intestinal parasites. They all made the rounds, and since bathers moved barefoot between toilets, steam rooms, and plunge pools, any trace left behind traveled far. That said, most Romans took their cleaning rituals seriously. After using the toilet, bathers would often rinse with water from basins or request a slave to pour it for them. Some used scented oils as a finishing touch. And don't forget the pumice stone, used not just for exfoliating skin, but occasionally for scrubbing down after toilet use. Not recommended, but very Roman. We also know from sources like Seneca that wealthy men sometimes carried personal cleaning kits, complete with perfume, oil flasks, and yes, their own sponge on a stick. Think of it as an ancient dop kit, but with more vinegar. Yet, not everyone loved the bathhouse vibe. Stoic philosophers, once again, had opinions. Epictetus warned his students that bathhouses were noisy, chaotic, and full of temptations, both moral and microbial. His advice? Enter with your expectations low. Good call. Still, for the average Roman, the bathhouse was a daily pleasure. You might sweat, soak, snack, and socialize, all under one roof. And if that included a trip to the loo, so be it. Some even embraced the moment. Marshall once wrote that the best jokes came during communal wiping. Whether that's true or not, it paints a vivid image. A room of half-naked men laughing and chatting mid-squat, as sponges drip and water gurgles beneath their feet. You linger in the bathhouse latrine a moment longer, watching a young boy refill a vinegar jar. The sponge rack creaks as someone grabs one, and outside you hear a vendor shouting about fig cakes and honey nuts. Time to move on. You step into the warm tepidarium, let the steam wrap around you, and try not to think about the sponge you just saw floating a little too close to the drain. Ah, cleanliness. Roman style. You emerge from the steamy tepidarium and back into the open street, your skin damp, your head full of sponge-related second thoughts. But something catches your eye, an unassuming doorway near a shop front, half covered by a drape of woven reeds. You peek inside. It's dim, quiet, and smells of incense and mildew. A woman in a dark cloak sits behind a small wooden table, and in front of her a jar, a tablet, a little brass spoon, and something that looks suspiciously like a bundle of herbs wrapped in red thread. You've just wandered into the shadowy world of Roman toilet magic. Yes, toilets and magic. A surprisingly common pairing in a city that believed spirits could pop up anywhere, especially places where bodies did something unpredictable. In Roman superstition, the latrine wasn't just a physical space. It was a spiritual hotspot. Think about it. Dark, enclosed, full of waste, and strangely intimate. That's practically a haunted house by ancient standards, and the Romans were nothing if not spiritually cautious. They believed malevolent forces, called lemurs or larvae, might sneak into the body through its, less defended exits, which meant that toilets needed spiritual reinforcement. Enter the protective charms. In homes, you might find tiny lead amulets hanging from doorways, etched with phrases like, "May foulness pass, not enter." Some families installed little terracotta figurines near their latrine, usually grotesque, wide-eyed creatures meant to scare away spirits. One popular figure was the god Priapus, infamous for his enormous defense mechanism. Let's just say he scared off more than bad smells. Historians still argue whether these figures were believed to literally protect the bathroom or whether they were humorous exaggerations. Either way, they were common. You can't walk 10 paces in Pompeii without spotting a grinning god standing guard near a gutter. Then there were curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with wishes, names, or threats, rolled up and tossed into latrines or sewers. Some begged the gods to punish an unfaithful lover. Others asked for revenge against a rival gladiator, merchant, or neighbor. Why the toilet? Because it was the underworld's mailbox. Romans believed that sewage flowed into sacred underground spaces. That made toilets ideal places to deliver messages to chthonic deities like Hecate, Pluto, or the Furies. You wouldn't drop a love note to Venus down there, but if you wanted to curse your cheating business partner's digestive system, perfect spot. One real example, a tablet found in Bath, England, a Roman colony, curses the thief of a cloak, asking the gods to afflict the culprit until the item is returned. The item? A bathhouse robe. The location? Probably near a latrine. Back in the dim little room, the woman behind the table offers to write your name on a wax tablet and whisper a protection chant. You decline politely, but she insists on one last suggestion: hang an iron nail above your toilet door. Iron, she says, confuses spirits. Noted. Roman magical thinking extended even to timing. Certain hours of the day were considered more dangerous for elimination, especially dusk and dawn, when boundaries between worlds blurred. That's when ghosts were thought to roam. If you had to use the toilet then, you might mutter protective phrases or make hand gestures to ward off ill luck. One common gesture, the fig sign, a closed fist with the thumb tucked between the first two fingers, kind of like a rude thumbs up. It was thought to symbolize fertility and scare off evil. Also popular, drawing a line in ash around the toilet, or burning herbs like myrrh and bay to cleanse the air. Not just for the smell, mind you, but for spiritual sanitation. You wander back outside and notice a small boy drawing a line in the dirt outside his home latrine. His grandmother watches approvingly. You smile. Old habits, deeply rooted. And these weren't just fringe beliefs. Even educated Romans took precautions. Pliny the Elder wrote that certain plants, like wormwood and vervain, could purify the air and protect from invisible forces. He also recommended rubbing vinegar on the body to avoid impure influences. Cato the Elder, ever practical, suggested reciting a charm when entering the latrine, especially if it hadn't been used in a while. Something short, mumbled, and addressed to the household gods. Because ultimately, what Romans feared wasn't the waste. It was what the waste attracted: spirits, sickness, social shame. The toilet was a vulnerable space, and vulnerability needed rituals. Even death was connected. Some tombstones refer to latrines as symbols of life's final departure. Euphemisms like, "he returned to the cloaca," were common among poets. Equal parts tragic and tongue-in-cheek. So as you continue down the street, the idea of magic in the loo doesn't seem quite so strange. After all, even today, people tape garlic to windows, knock on wood, or refuse to say Macbeth in a theater. The Romans just took it a step further, with curse tablets, penis charms, and nighttime fig signs. As you pass under another archway, you pause for a moment, pat the lintel, and mutter, "Stay out, stay down," just in case someone or something is listening. You turn the corner, and the hum of city life fades. Suddenly, you're in a quieter quarter, where grander homes rise behind tall walls. Stone gates, lush courtyards, painted frescoes peeking through open doors. This is the world of the elite Roman toilet, and oh yes, it's exactly what you think, because when you've got coin, even your commode makes a statement. You step into a domus, a wealthy Roman townhouse, and you're greeted not by a butler, but by cool tiled floors, running fountains, and the scent of rose oil drifting from the atrium. Somewhere down a corridor, servants are preparing wine. Somewhere else, a parrot is squawking someone's name in Latin. And somewhere nearby, the toilet. Private toilets in elite Roman homes were usually tucked into small rooms near the kitchen or bedrooms, sometimes even hidden behind panels or curtains. But don't let the modesty fool you. These weren't humble stalls. First, the materials. No cracked stone benches here. Marble seats, sometimes carved with elegant curves to fit the sitter more comfortably, line the walls of well-to-do toilets. The walls might be decorated with painted panels, floral designs, or even images of gods. Yes, gods, watching as you did your business. Slightly unsettling, but that was kind of the point. Everything in a Roman home reminded you of divine order. Even here, the floor might be inlaid with colorful mosaics, often abstract, but sometimes comically on the nose. In one villa, archaeologists found a toilet room with a mosaic of dolphins leaping over waves. Peaceful until you remember what's happening in the room. And, of course, there were toilet implements. A proper household didn't rely on shared public sponges. Instead, you might have a personal wiping cloth or even your own version of the tersorium, cleaned between uses by slaves with vinegar or salt water. Wealthier homes might use pieces of wool, linen scraps, or soft moss imported from cooler climates. Yes, imported moss for wiping. Historians still argue whether these luxurious items were used daily or reserved for guests. But the existence of such goods tells us something important. The Roman upper class didn't just want comfort. They wanted ritualized comfort. And speaking of guests, some elite homes had guest toilets near the entrance. That's right. You could show up, sip watered wine in the vestibule, and if needed, excuse yourself to a small, well-tiled chamber with a faint scent of cinnamon oil. Because let's face it, hospitality meant everything. And nothing kills a dinner party faster than an emergency with no options. In one famous example, the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum had multiple toilets, including one near the library. Yes, the Roman version of multitasking, a latrine within sight of rare scrolls. Read, reflect, relieve, all within reach. Just mind the parchment. Roman architects were clever about where they placed these facilities. Waste often drained into underground channels connected to the street sewer. In some homes, a separate pipe system, gravity-fed of course, carried it into cesspits or water gardens where it was used to fertilize plants. Efficient, if a bit fragrant. And don't assume that only the men of the house had access. Elite Roman women also used these toilets, though servants may have assisted in setup, cleaning, or discreetly removing chamber pots. Privacy was a fluid concept in ancient Rome. What mattered more was hierarchy. If you outranked everyone else in the household, you could do what you pleased wherever you pleased. Sometimes, even banquet rooms featured toilets discreetly located behind hanging curtains. In larger homes, dinner might stretch for hours, so having a convenient solution close at hand was, shall we say, practical. After all, ancient Romans believed in moderation in theory, but not always in wine. One slightly unnerving trend among the elite: decorative latrine sculptures. Some villas featured figurines of gods, birds, or animals perched above or beside the seat. A few even had carvings of satyrs, grinning goatmen, leering from the corner. Maybe they were meant to amuse, or maybe to remind you the gods see everything. Still, the richest households had another option: portable toilets. Think of a finely crafted wooden stool with a removable chamber pot below. It could be moved to wherever you were staying, from a garden pavilion to a traveling litter. Some had padded seats, others were lacquered and painted. The Emperor Nero, famously theatrical, is said to have traveled with his own set of toilet implements, plus a servant whose only job was to ensure his comfort. Imagine being that guy on your resume. You glance around the private chamber you're now standing in. The stone seat is polished from years of use. A vine design creeps across the mosaic floor. A tiny window lets in dappled light. It's quiet, peaceful, even beautiful. And it hits you. For all the noise, crowds, and shared sponges of Roman life, here is a pocket of true privacy, a moment of calm in the chaos, a luxury not everyone had. You step back out into the Paris-style garden, where a slave offers you a fig and a goblet of watered wine. Somewhere in the distance, someone plays a flute, and you think, for all their faults, the Romans knew how to enjoy life, even the parts no one talks about, especially those. The sun starts to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the paving stones as you step away from the private world of the elite and back into the noisy crush of the street. But now we turn our attention from stone seats and sponge sticks to something far subtler and, frankly, more dangerous. You inhale cautiously. Ah, yes, the unmistakable aroma of ancient Roman sewer gas. That's right. Tonight we delve into the underbelly, literally, of Rome's sanitation system and the hazards that bubbled up from below. The Romans were rightly proud of their cloaca maxima, the greatest sewer, a massive engineering marvel that drained the marshy lowlands between the city's hills and funneled waste into the Tiber. Built originally by the Etruscans, expanded by Roman kings and emperors, it carried storm runoff, household waste, and latrine outflow beneath the feet of thousands. But here's the thing: it wasn't airtight, not by a long shot. You stroll past a street grate, just a carved stone channel with a cover that looks like it's seen better centuries. A warm gust rises up from it. You flinch. Why? Because what's swirling beneath you is a cocktail of methane, ammonia, sulfur dioxide, and a hint of tragedy. In other words, sewer gas. And the Romans were well aware it could be a problem. Not only was it a nose-wrinkling nuisance, but it was also dangerous. Ancient sources occasionally mention explosions or fires caused by lamps or braziers placed too close to sewer vents. If you're picturing a dignified Roman dinner being interrupted by a sudden whoosh from the floor, you're not far off. Some Roman writers describe sudden gusts of unholy wind bursting up from drains and latrines, often accompanied by illness or fainting. Historians still argue whether these reports were exaggerated or if methane buildup could really have created such dramatic outcomes. But one thing's clear, the fear of miasma, or bad air, was very real. The Romans believed that disease was spread by foul-smelling air. And to be fair, in a world without germ theory, that's not a bad guess. If you were vomiting and the neighborhood smelled like boiled sewage, the two probably felt connected. So, what did they do about it? Enter the ventilation shafts. In some better-designed sewer systems, vertical shafts led from the main tunnels to the surface, allowing gases to escape without filling people's homes, or worse, bathhouses. These also allowed workers to drop down for maintenance. Yes, sewer workers. Brave souls known as cloacae servientes, literally, servants of the sewer. They were tasked with crawling into the underworld to clear blockages, redirect flows, and occasionally fish out dead animals or lost objects, or worse, living animals. Which brings us to a Roman urban legend that just won't die. Sewer snakes, or rats, or eels, or even, brace yourself, octopuses. No kidding. Some sources, not always reliable ones, describe strange creatures living in the bowels of the city, emerging occasionally through drains or even latrine seats. One account tells of a child bitten on the rear end by a serpent while relieving himself in the dark. Another describes an eel escaping from a bathhouse drain and slithering across a mosaic floor mid-massage. Were these just stories? Most likely. But you try sitting over a dark hole in the ground and not imagining something wet and toothy slithering towards you. Modern archaeologists have found evidence of rats and other pests in Roman sewer systems, but no definitive proof of bathhouse krakens. Still, in a city where water flowed constantly and food scraps traveled through pipes, nature was never far away. To combat the gas problem and the creatures, Romans occasionally poured lime, vinegar, or ash down latrines. Some even burned incense or left bowls of herbs near sewer grates. The idea was to purify the air and keep the worst at bay. One charming Roman household ritual involved tossing small cakes into the toilet as an offering to underworld spirits. Imagine baking for your bathroom. The gods were everywhere, after all, even under your feet. You pause near another street drain where steam curls upward like a sigh from the underworld. The nearby wall is discolored, evidence of years of rising heat and vapor. And yet it still functions, still drains, still protects the city from itself. Even in elite homes, sewer gas found ways to intrude. Wealthier Romans sometimes had pipes that connected their private latrines directly to the city system. But without any kind of trap or seal, it meant the stink traveled back up the line. Wealth had its perks, but airtight plumbing wasn't one of them. Some households tried primitive backflow preventers, ceramic S-shaped bends in the drain, or plug-like objects stuffed into the hole between uses. Think of it as the Roman version of the modern toilet flapper. Inelegant, but occasionally effective. Of course, there were no flush handles. Most latrines relied on a steady stream of water diverted from aqueducts or cisterns to keep things moving. The trick was constant flow. If that stopped during drought, war, or maintenance, you were in for a very aromatic surprise. So, as the last light of day hits the rooftops and Roman street lamps flicker to life, you glance once more into a sewer vent and whisper a thank you to the silent laborers who kept it flowing. Because down there, in the dark, steamy, gassy tunnels, was a world that most Romans never saw, but that shaped their lives, quite literally, from the bottom up. And it still breathes beneath your feet. You step away from the drain and onto a quieter street, where the air is, thankfully, less adventurous. Children chase each other with hoops. A fig seller dozes beneath his cart. And ahead of you, a man in a worn toga sits on a low stool next to a stack of clay jars and sponges. Yes, it's time to meet the unsung hero of Roman sanitation, the Sponge Man. His proper title? Unknown. But his function? Essential. This man is part cleaner, part merchant, and part biohazard technician. His job? To collect used tersoria, sponge-on-a-stick implements from public latrines, and clean, store, and redistribute them for the next round of bottom-related business. Let that sink in for a moment. In the Roman public latrine system, the sponge wasn't a one-and-done affair. No disposable wipes, no flushable tissue. Instead, users shared a communal implement, rinsed between uses in running water or vinegar jars placed below the seat. But someone had to maintain the system. Someone had to make sure the sponge didn't become a sponge problem. So here he is. He likely began his morning collecting used sponges from the night before, tossed into rinse jars, left on the latrine ledge, or dropped into the drainage channel. Wearing a short tunic and sandals he definitely regrets, he hauls the bundle to a nearby cistern or basin. Cleaning involved more than just a splash. Some sponge men used a mixture of salt water, vinegar, and wood ash to disinfect the tools. Others boiled them. Some, less hygienically, just gave them a rinse and hoped for the best. It depended on how well the local guild paid him, or whether anyone was watching. Historians still argue whether the sponge was meant to be rinsed after every use by the user, or whether it was collected, cleaned, and redistributed like library books. It was probably a bit of both, depending on how high traffic the toilet was and how disciplined the patrons. We do know that sponge-related infection was a concern. Medical texts from the time warn about using tainted cleaning cloths or shared wiping tools, especially when symptoms of dysentery or intestinal worms were already present. Yes, there were rules, unenforced, sure, but technically, a sick person was supposed to bring their own sponge. You imagine the awkward moment. "Excuse me, do you have a sponge I can borrow?" "Sorry, I'm a bit runny today." Even in Rome, some lines shouldn't be crossed. The sponge man wasn't just a cleaner. He also likely sold fresh sponges, imported from regions around the Mediterranean. Natural sea sponges were harvested in places like the Aegean and North African coast, prized for their softness and durability. A new tersorium stick could be bought and reused at home. Wealthier citizens might even oil them or wrap them in fabric to soften the texture. Others preferred rougher textures, exfoliating, in the gentlest possible interpretation of that word. Some Romans skipped the sponge entirely and used pottery shards, called ostraca, to scrape themselves clean. Cheap, plentiful, and sharp. Greek sources mention this method too, often with wincing caution. A popular schoolboy insult of the day: "May your ostrakon be jagged." Ouch! Back at the stall, the sponge man carefully inspects each implement. Any sponge that can't be salvaged is tossed, probably into the sewer system or the dump heap outside town. New ones are soaked in vinegar water, tied onto fresh sticks and stacked neatly for sale or reuse. You marvel at his patience. His hands are calloused, his sandals crusted with things you don't want to describe. Yet he works with steady rhythm, humming an old tavern song as he wrings out another vinegary bundle. A young boy approaches with a coin and a grimace. The sponge man nods, wraps a fresh tersorium in waxed cloth, and hands it over like a sacred relic. Transaction complete. And here's a strange detail. Some Roman poets, like Catullus, actually used the sponge as a metaphor. In one famously crude verse, he refers to someone as a sponge for the sins of men. It's poetic in the worst way. Sponge culture was so ubiquitous that it even crept into military slang. Some Roman soldiers called new recruits sponge carriers, a term of mockery for anyone stuck with the worst chores. And believe it or not, some commanders issued personal tersoria to high-ranking officers, a perk of command. Meanwhile, slaves who managed private household latrines were sometimes nicknamed spongari, the sponge guys. Not glamorous, but essential. You didn't want a bad spongarius. That was how infections spread, rumors started, and marriages ended. And if you're wondering, yes, there were accidents. One minor text mentions a man who dropped his tersorium into the latrine channel and, in a panic, tried to retrieve it. He fell in. The account ends with "he was not missed." Whether that's a joke or a warning, no one knows. You walk past the sponge man's stall, nodding in respect. He returns it, lifting his sponge-tied stick like a salute. A strange, fragrant, vinegar-soaked salute. And you realize, for all Rome's senators, soldiers, and scholars, it's these folks, the sponge washers, sewer scrapers, and vinegar haulers, who kept the city running. Silently, smelly, but running. So next time you complain about low-quality toilet paper or a broken bathroom lock, remember the sponge man and maybe pour out a little vinegar in his honor. Just not too close to the drain. You head further into the city now, and the buzz of the forum echoes through tall columns. Stalls crowd the marble arcades, senators gesture at scrolls, and hawkers shout about olives and lamp oil. But just beyond the edge of this grand civic scene lies something more practical, more pungent, and equally essential: the urinal alley. Rome had plenty of toilets. It also had a whole lot of pee. And while much of it ended up in latrines or chamber pots, the city also relied on a strange little invention that modern urban dwellers might recognize immediately: the street-side urinal jar. These weren't toilets in the traditional sense. They were open amphorae, built into walls or standing in doorways, tucked beside inns, taverns, and busy street corners. Men, yes, primarily men, used them casually as they passed, sometimes barely stopping mid-sentence. No walls, no privacy, just a jar, a cloak flick, and back to business. Historians still argue whether these jars were placed by individuals, business owners, or city authorities. But they were everywhere because people needed to go all the time, and Rome was a walking city. The average Roman didn't drive to the supermarket. He walked, he talked, and yes, he urinated. One Roman poet, Martial, even mocks a fellow citizen for using every jar on a single walk home. That man, he writes, waters the street more than the sky does. An ancient burn, if there ever was one. These jars weren't just for convenience. They were part of a larger economy. Remember that urine tax? The vectigal urinae? These jars were one of its main sources. Urine was collected by fulonicae, or fullers, the laundry professionals of ancient Rome. They used urine's natural ammonia content to strip grease and stains from clothing, especially togas. It worked surprisingly well. If you've ever cleaned windows with vinegar, you're halfway to understanding the Roman system. So these jars weren't left to slosh about and spill over. Someone came by, often a boy or slave employed by the fuller's shop, and scooped up the contents, pouring them into sealed barrels or amphorae to be hauled off to the workshop. Talk about a thankless job. The average Roman didn't find this strange. They understood that their pee had value. It was part of the circular economy, waste to utility, just like compost today. But as always in Rome, where there's waste, there's humor. Graffiti near some of these street jars pokes fun at passers-by. He who fills this pot shall stink less than he who misses. Dedicated to Pluto, take what's his. And sometimes not so subtle warnings. Don't touch Fuller's property. Imagine writing, "Do not steal pee on your house." The jars weren't without controversy, though. Shop owners didn't always appreciate having them nearby. The smell, the puddles, the splash zone. Tavern owners occasionally bribed local officials to have jars moved or cleaned more often. Wealthier neighborhoods even petitioned to have their alleys declared jar-free. You pause near one of these jars now. It's built into a niche in a stone wall, shaped like a wine jug, but with the top smashed off and a deep discoloration staining the bricks around it. Above it, carved into the stone, a small face grimaces, a mask of a local spirit meant to protect the jar from vandalism. Or perhaps from shame. Interestingly, women had far fewer options when it came to street urination. There's little archaeological evidence of similar facilities for women, and written sources suggest women relied more on chamber pots or latrines when available. But that didn't mean street relief never happened. In emergencies, women may have used cloaks or companions to shield them. One Roman comedy even features a scene where a woman fakes fainting in the street, only to discreetly relieve herself while a crowd gathers. Subtle, efficient, probably uncomfortable. But then again, the streets of Rome were always performative. You weren't just walking, you were seen, and bodily functions, while necessary, were carefully balanced with appearances, which is why urine thieves, yes, really, became a problem. Since collected urine was valuable, some less reputable folks began stealing it from jars before the official fuller's collectors could get there. Guards were occasionally hired. Some jars were chained in place. Others had lids or false bottoms to make theft harder. Imagine being the guy who specializes in black market pee. Eventually, some fullers worked directly with bathhouses, brothels, or inns, where urine flow was more reliable and security tighter. It became a side contract. You provide the guests, we collect the rest. The phrase urina regis, the king's urine, was coined sarcastically for this business. If your jar was placed near a magistrate's house or a popular senator's villa, the urine was of higher quality and fetched better cleaning results. Totally unscientific, totally Roman. You glance down another alley and spot 3 jars in a row, full of property, judging by the marks. One has a lid, another is steaming faintly in the afternoon heat. A tabby cat naps beside the third, unfazed. You walk on, and suddenly this seemingly small part of city life, the pea jars, the collectors, the tax, feels like the backbone of a civilization trying to keep itself clean, one trickle at a time. You might even say, it's the little streams that keep the empire flowing. As dusk settles and the taverns begin lighting their torches, the hum of the Roman evening comes alive. Laughter from wine-soaked courtyards, footsteps over worn paving stones, dogs barking somewhere in the distance. But you're heading towards something quieter, something more domestic, because tonight you're being invited into the private lives of ordinary Romans, not senators or sponge magnates, but regular folks and their most intimate companion, the chamber pot. You cross the threshold of an insula, a multi-story Roman apartment block that towers over the cramped street like a brick beehive. These structures house the vast majority of Rome's population: shopkeepers, scribes, laborers, and families of 5 in 2 tiny rooms. Inside, it's dark, narrow, and smells faintly of lentils and charcoal smoke. Up a creaky staircase into a cramped unit the size of a modern garden shed, you find the centerpiece of tonight's curiosity, a clay pot tucked under a low stool, the humble Matella. This was the everyman's toilet. There was no plumbing, no sewer pipe, no flush, just a pot, your knees, and a prayer that the kids didn't knock it over again. The chamber pot was usually ceramic, sometimes bronze, rarely fancy. It could be squat and bowl-like, or tall with handles and a lid. Wealthier families had versions made of metal or with decorated rims, but for most it was a basic utility used by men, women, and children alike, especially during the night. Because going outside after dark in Rome, not ideal. The streets could be dangerous. Thieves, wild dogs, or just the awkward logistics of a 5th-floor apartment and no elevator. Most insulae didn't have internal plumbing. Some had a shared latrine in the courtyard or on the ground floor, but that meant stairs. And when nature called at midnight, no one was making that trek with a torch and a tunic. So the chamber pot reigned. Each morning, someone, usually the family's youngest or a household slave, would take the full pot down and empty it into the nearest cesspit or sewer drain, sometimes even directly into the street gutter, especially in poorer areas. Yes, really, there are plenty of ancient complaints about residents flinging their business out the window with only a half-hearted shout of "Cave Canum! Watch out below!" And yes, this led to accidents. Marshall again comes to our aid with a vivid poem about a man crushed to death by a fallen chamber pot. Not the contents, the pot. Talk about a poor obituary. To prevent such tragic comedy, Roman law actually regulated waste disposal. It was technically illegal to throw anything from a window without warning. If someone was injured by flying filth, the property owner was liable to pay damages. Not that this always stopped it. You walk past a neighbor pouring their chamber pot contents into a gutter with the weary grace of routine. The liquid snakes down the groove in the street toward a storm drain. No one blinks, just another morning chore. But the pot wasn't just about convenience, it was also tied to health. Doctors like Galen and Celsus encouraged observation of urine and stool as indicators of wellness. Chamber pots allowed people to examine their own, a sort of ancient self-diagnosis. Is it too red, too pale, floating, smelling like sulfur? You'd better call the medicus. Some chamber pots even had built-in spouts or strainers to separate liquid from solid waste for easier analysis or disposal. Resourceful, if not elegant. And speaking of elegance, one satirical poem describes a woman so obsessed with her image that she had a chamber pot engraved with her initials. Just imagine monogrammed bathroom wear for guests. There were even travel chamber pots, small portable versions that could be carried in carriages or used during long banquets. These were usually hidden discreetly beneath the dining couch or behind a screen. Because remember, Roman banquets could last hours, and no one wanted to leave the party and lose their seat. Historians still argue whether these portable versions were used openly at gatherings or discreetly removed to side rooms. But archaeological evidence of potty-shaped furniture suggests some were bold enough to multitask. Roman children, too, had their own miniature pots, often painted with animals or cheerful scenes. You can almost picture a toddler perched on a lion-themed toilet while Mum stirs lentils nearby. Charming in a sticky sort of way. And if someone was sick or elderly, chamber pots became vital. Bedside versions were kept in corners or beneath reclining couches. Slaves or family members would discreetly manage the contents. For the infirm, the pot was part of survival. Even Rome's military used them. Soldiers carried portable urinals, sometimes built into packs or camp gear. Called motulae, they were lightweight, durable, and often reused. Some pots have been recovered with names scratched into them. Marcus, one reads. Property of Titus, says another. You know you've made it in life when even your toilet has your name on it. You step outside again into the warm Roman night. Torches flicker along the avenue. Somewhere in the darkness, a chamber pot lid clicks back into place. A dog sniffs a drain, and a woman yells at a boy not to trip over the handle this time. You smile. The whole city, you realize, hums not just with the grandeur of forums and temples, but with the rhythms of everyday life, of meals, of messes, of chamber pots cleaned in the dawn. In the end, the mighty empire rested on surprisingly humble porcelain, or rather clay, thrones. The moon is up now, glinting off terracotta roof tiles as the city slows. But not everyone's asleep. You're walking along the fringe of a marketplace where torchlight flickers through canvas stalls, and the clink of coins still whispers under hushed voices. You're about to meet a Roman professional you didn't know existed, the toilet attendant. Not the sponge man, not the sewer worker. This was a different role, half janitor, half social manager, stationed inside or near public latrines. Their job? To keep the whole strange ballet of Roman bathroom behavior moving smoothly. You duck into a semicircular brick structure that looks like a ruin from the outside, but inside, rows of stone seats, a low channel of running water, a small brazier for warmth, and one tired man in a short tunic holding a ladle. He nods at you, doesn't speak. He's the one who refills the sponge-cleaning jars, stokes the coals, sweeps up dropped scraps, shoos out loiterers, and occasionally, if someone's drunk or too feeble, helps them into position. It's quiet work, but not unimportant. Some historians refer to this role as a kind of latrinarius or foricarius, terms loosely translated as latrine keeper. But the title varied by location. In military camps, he might be called a curator foricae, the curator of the commode. which is either prestigious or pitiful, depending on your standards. Attendants were especially necessary in high-traffic latrines like those near the Forum or large bathhouses. These spaces could see hundreds of users a day. Imagine a restroom at a modern stadium with togas. Without this guy, chaos. One of his key responsibilities was managing the sponge workflow. People often forgot to rinse their tersorium properly, or they argued over who got the clean one, or they didn't realize it was the same sponge they'd used yesterday. The attendant kept a rotation going, tossing used sponges into a rinse vat, handing out fresh ones, and discouraging double dippers. And if the sponge jar got too dirty, he dumped it, cleaned the basin, refilled it with vinegar water, and moved on. This happened several times a day. He also dealt with what you left behind. Even though Roman latrines were ingeniously designed with water channels, blockages still occurred. Leaves, rags, or worse, might clog the channel. And guess who had to reach in, often barehanded, and fix it? Our guy. His tools, a long-handled paddle, a vinegar bucket, and a quiet, grim determination. This was not a job for the squeamish. And yet, attendants often developed relationships with their regular users, patrons who came by every day. Gossip passed over the stone seats, little favors exchanged. Hold this pouch while I go, or watch my sandals. One satirist even wrote of a man who trusted his toilet guard more than his own brother. Because public latrines were social spaces, people talked, debated, mocked each other. Poets, lawyers, merchants, they all sat side by side. The attendant, often listening quietly nearby, became a sort of informal information broker. He heard things, knew things. There's even some evidence that attendants passed messages between users or warned them when arrival was near. Imagine getting insider market tips while relieving yourself. Some patrons tipped well. A few wealthy users, embarrassed by the public nature of latrines, paid attendants to block the door while they used the stall or to reserve their favorite seat. Because, yes, people had favorite seats, usually near the water channel, away from the draft, or with a better view. But not all was glamorous. Latrine attendants were often low status, sometimes even enslaved. They were mocked in literature, avoided in polite company, and likely paid very little. Still, they played a crucial role in public health. A well-maintained latrine helped prevent disease. It kept crowds moving. It provided a strange, smelly kind of dignity, and sometimes they saved lives. One story tells of an attendant who noticed a user collapse on the seat, struck perhaps by a heart attack or stroke. The attendant carried him out, called for help, and was later praised by the man's family. Another tale, less heartwarming, involves an attendant helping a drunk nobleman into the latrine, and then having to fish him back out. The brazier in the corner flickers as you watch him work. He lifts the lid of a sponge jar, sniffs it, grimaces, and replaces the water. Then he moves to the far side, where someone has dropped a strip of cloth. He picks it up with a stick and tosses it out a side window into the dump channel. Efficient, quiet. And when a group of young men stumble in, loud and wine-scented, he barely glances up, just hands them clean sticks, gestures toward the bench, and returns to scrubbing a seat with what looks like an old rag dipped in lime water. It's a strange moment of calm, this workman in his torch-lit chamber, watching over a place most people would rather not think about. But without him, the empire would quite literally collapse into filth. You step back out into the night, the warm air brushing your face. Behind you, the door creaks shut. A low whistle floats from inside, someone humming as they mop the floor. And you realize, even Rome, with all its marble and glory, needed someone to mop the floor, especially there. The streets are nearly empty now, save for the scurry of cats and the shuffle of sandals returning home late. You pass shuttered stalls and smoking oil lamps, your path lit by the orange glow of dying coals. Rome is winding down, but even now, even at this hour, there's movement, quiet, rhythmic, urgent. Tonight, you follow a woman. She's carrying something carefully wrapped in cloth, walking quickly, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. Not fearfully, just discreetly. She slips through a gate into a small courtyard where other figures are gathered around a shallow pit. This is not a latrine. This is a ritual toilet. Now, don't get too excited. There's no chanting or incense. But what you're witnessing is something uniquely Roman, the intersection of sanitation and superstition, the blend of bodily functions with the beliefs that guided their world. Because Romans didn't just use toilets for physical relief. Sometimes they used them to communicate with the dead. Yes, through the toilet. The pit this woman stands over is a privatus putius, a private household dump or latrine pit. It's modest, not elaborate, but her movements are precise. She unwraps her bundle, revealing a small wax figurine and a scrap of cloth tied with string. She drops it in. Then she whispers something. Historians still debate what exactly these acts meant. Some believe they were offerings, tiny sacrifices to household spirits, underworld deities, or ancestors. Others think they were curse tablets or defixiones, pleas for divine justice, punishment, or love. And toilets, sewers, and drains were the delivery system. Why? Because Romans believed these subterranean places were gateways, thin places where the world above and below touched, a place where messages could pass through. Remember Pluto, god of the underworld? Some Roman homes had tiny shrines to him in the latrine, often just a carved tile or painted mask. Others made offerings of food scraps, hair clippings, or even blood dropped into drains to keep restless spirits from lingering too close. You blink. It's a lot to take in. But think of it this way. When everything that leaves your body is literally flowing down into the depths, it's not hard to start imagining who or what might be watching from below. In fact, there's evidence that Roman children were warned not to look too long into the latrine hole, not because of snakes or eels, but because a spirit might look back. One famous Roman ghost story tells of a woman haunted by visions after disturbing a sewer pit while sweeping. She claimed to see faces in the shadows near her drain. A priest was brought in, incense was burned. The pit was sealed with a stone marked with protective symbols. Problem solved? Who knows? But Romans didn't take chances. Even in large public latrines, there was ritual. Some archaeologists have found small amulets, bronze charms, and carved figurines tucked behind seats or dropped into the water channel. Were they accidentally lost? Maybe. But many were found in latrines that had no access from above, meaning they were placed intentionally during construction. Builders, it seems, made foundational offerings to protect against bad luck, disease, or foul spirits, especially in a place where, let's face it, luck was often tested. And then there's the strange business of naming your toilet. No, seriously, some Romans gave their latrines names, nicknames, usually mocking or playful. A recovered inscription reads, "Here sits Marcus, master of wind." Another shows graffiti with the phrase, "To the cave of Cerberus," a three-headed joke for a three-seated latrine. These weren't just bathroom humor. They were ritual humor, a way of diffusing discomfort, of keeping darker thoughts at bay. Because if a toilet connected you to the underworld, maybe a joke could keep the demons laughing long enough to leave you alone. You glance down a side street and see a public fountain, its trickling water soothing in the night air. A woman dips a ladle into it, fills a jar, and walks off toward her insula, likely to pour it into a pot, not for drinking, but for flushing. Even that, in Rome, might have been done with a whispered prayer. It's easy to forget that the ancient world didn't separate the sacred and the profane the way we often do. To them, waste wasn't just waste. It was evidence of life, of appetite, age, fertility, and decay. And the gods, especially the strange ones, were always watching. Take Cloacina, for example, the goddess of the main sewer. Her name literally means the purifier, and she had an actual shrine near the Roman Forum. That's right, an official altar. To a sewer goddess, people left coins there, flowers, incense. Imagine that, standing before a stone marker, thanking the divine for clean pipes. You return to the courtyard, but the woman is gone. The pit has been covered. The wax figure is somewhere below, melting, mixing with runoff and soot on its way toward the Tiber. You stand for a moment, imagining what she whispered. Maybe it was a name, maybe a wish, maybe a curse. Then a door creaks shut, a lock clicks, and the night resumes its quiet rhythm, as if nothing happened. But something did. And Rome's underworld just got one whisper louder. The Tiber shimmers in the moonlight now, dark and sluggish, carrying away the city's secrets with a soft, sucking whisper. You follow its edge toward the industrial fringe of Rome, where commerce, craft, and less savory trades make their homes. This is not the polished marble world of the Senate. This is where the smells bite a little harder, where the streets are quieter, but the work never truly stops. You're about to visit a place that truly tested the Roman stomach, the Pholonica, a fuller's workshop. And yes, it smells exactly how you imagine. You duck into a stone building that feels more like a barn than a business. Troughs line the floor, some filled with cloudy water, others with pale yellow liquid. Ropes hang from the ceiling, fabrics lie in messy heaps, and in the middle, half submerged in a basin, a man is stomping, barefoot, in what is unmistakably urine. Welcome to Roman dry cleaning. The Pholonica was the place where clothes went to get clean, or at least cleaner. Romans didn't wash their tunics at home. Fabric care was a specialist task, handled by trained professionals who knew how to whiten wool, remove wine stains, and keep a toga crisp enough for court. And their secret weapon? Pee, specifically collected human urine, rich in ammonia, which acts as a natural cleaning agent and degreaser. Earlier, we saw the jars along the street, the amphorae, casually used by passers-by. Now you see where all that yellow gold ended up. Each day, boys and workers hauled in jars of urine, dumping them into soaking vats. Garments were submerged, agitated, and then, yes, trampled by workers whose job it was to mash, twist, and stir the fabric underfoot. This wasn't symbolic. This was science, Roman style. After stomping, the clothes were rinsed with water, sometimes lye or fuller's earth, a kind of clay, then hung to dry. A final brushing with a metal comb or teasel plant gave them that fresh look. If the fabric needed whitening, they used sulfur smoke. Fullers placed the clothing in a small chamber and burned sulfur underneath, essentially fumigating the garment until it looked newer. If your eyes are watering at the thought, you're not alone. The workers wore no protection, and coughing fits were considered normal. So next time you complain about your dry cleaner losing a button, just remember, at least they didn't fumigate your suit with acid fog while stomping on it barefoot in fermented pee. The Pholonica wasn't just a place of labor, it was a social hub. Wealthy clients came to inspect their garments. Gossip passed between workers. Poems were scratched onto walls. One surviving graffito reads, "I stepped in what no man should, twice." Another simply says, "Marcia owes 2 tunics. Do not serve her." Rome's economy was deeply tied to these shops. Fullers belonged to guilds, paid taxes, and had working relationships with households, inns, and even temples. Temple garments, ceremonial robes, and military uniforms all passed through the vats at some point. But with all that prestige came risk. The Pholonica stank. Neighbors hated them. Property values dropped near their walls. And if a fuller dumped waste improperly, say, into a clean aqueduct, they could be fined or even shut down. Yet, strangely, the job wasn't always low status. Some fullers became wealthy entrepreneurs, owning multiple shops, employing dozens of workers, and building impressive tombs. One famously carved on his epitaph, "I made Rome whiter than marble." Historians still argue whether fullers specialized by fabric. Some may have handled only wool, others linen. Some probably took in laundry only from certain clients, upper class, religious, military. What's clear is that your clothes said something, and keeping them sharp mattered. And the workers? They were usually freedmen, former slaves who had bought or earned their freedom. Others were young boys, often starting at age 10 or 11, who learned the trade and built their lives in these steaming, smelly halls. One strange wrinkle in the Fullonica world. They sometimes offered garment finishing services that involved altering the shape, length, or even color of clothing to suit a new trend. So they weren't just cleaners, they were also early fashion consultants. You step carefully past a drying rack where rows of tunics hang like ghosts. A man brushes one with a stiff bundle of reeds, muttering to himself. Another ladle dips fresh urine into a new vat, measuring it by scent. Yes, scent. It's a skill. At the far end of the workshop is a basin reserved for special garments, white wool togas, ceremonial wear. The worker handling this basin wears a cleaner tunic, his sandals oiled, his hands careful. It's an honor, in a way, to treat the fabric of priests and magistrates. But even here, things go wrong. One source mentions a scandal where a toga came out stained purple, a forbidden color reserved for the emperor. The fuller was arrested. Whether it was a prank or an accident, no one knows. But it shows you just how serious clothing was in Roman society. Even a splash of the wrong dye could mean exile. And speaking of dye, fullers often worked near dyers' shops, exchanging materials or sharing runoff. A miscommunication between the two could result in a blue tunic becoming green or vice versa. Angry customers weren't rare. One poem ends with a curse. May your vats boil dry and your cloth turn goat-colored. Ouch! As you leave the Fullonica, the heat and stench fall away. The Tiber breeze feels like a gift. Somewhere behind you, another pair of sandals begins to stomp in rhythm, and you realize the empire's look, its crisp pleats, spotless hems, and radiant wool, was built not by tailors or nobles, but by the men who cleaned it all with vinegar and foot sweat. The next toga you see, spare a thought for the vat it came from. The streets are silver now, lit by moonlight, and the last few torches sputtering in their sconces. Rome is quiet, mostly, but there's still one more place to visit before the city sleeps. You follow a crooked alley toward a hill where a strange cluster of rounded brick towers rise like mushrooms in the night. They're warm, steaming, and buzzing with flies. You've arrived at the final frontier of Roman sanitation, the public cesspits and night soil collectors, those who dealt with what didn't flow away neatly with water. Because not all waste made it into the cloaca, and not every home had a drain. Some buildings used dry toilets, simple holes over pits or jars that had to be emptied by hand. Others, especially in crowded districts, relied on communal cesspits, dug deep into the ground and lined with clay or stone, and someone had to clean them out. These were the foricariae, stercorariae, or, less kindly, the dung men. You hear one before you see him, a slosh, a grunt, and the scrape of a wooden shovel. Around the back of the nearest tower, a man emerges, carrying a sloshing bucket on a yoke over his shoulders. He's barefoot, shirtless, splattered. He does not smell good, but he nods as he passes. His job, vital. These collectors worked mostly at night, hence their nickname, night soil men. By moonlight or torch, they made their rounds, emptying cesspits, chamber pots, and waste jars left at designated spots. In large cities like Rome, a full pit could mean overflow, disease, and unbearable stench. So their work was urgent. Some pits were attached to latrine systems without drainage, especially in older or poorer neighborhoods. They had to be shoveled out manually. Then the contents, called stercus, were hauled away in carts or amphorae to designated waste fields outside the city walls. That's right, Rome had poop zones. These dumping grounds, like the Ager near the Servian wall or slopes outside the Porta Capena, were literal mountains of excrement, managed or ignored, depending on how generous the Senate was feeling that year. Historians still argue whether there were official contracts for waste collection or if it was a free-for-all. In some cases, landowners paid privately to have pits emptied, while in others, local officials might assign a team of stercorariae to cover a whole block. Was there a union? Maybe. Was there hazard pay? Not likely. But surprisingly, dung had value. It could be sold as fertilizer to nearby farms, vineyards, or olive groves. Especially animal dung, but even human waste mixed with straw or ash had agricultural uses. Some night soil collectors doubled as manure vendors, with fixed routes and repeat customers. And here's a strange twist. Some scholars believe poop was taxed, or at least regulated. That's right. Roman officials may have monitored where waste went and how much was moved to prevent illegal dumping, or, worse, people skipping the disposal fee and tossing it straight into the street, which did happen. Often. Remember earlier, the chamber pots flung from windows? Well, if you didn't want to pay a collector, or if you lived too far from a cesspit, the temptation to chuck your troubles into the gutter was very real. Laws were written, fines imposed, angry neighbors shouted from balconies. But in truth, nighttime in Rome often reeked, And sometimes it wasn't just about smells, it was about safety. There are stories of cesspits collapsing, especially when left too long unemptied. Imagine walking through your courtyard and suddenly plunging into a fermented soup of centuries-old secrets. One ancient letter describes a villa guest falling into a hidden waste shaft and emerging the color of plague. On a darker note, some ancient crimes involved using cesspits to hide bodies. They were easy to access, rarely searched, and almost never disturbed without cause. More than one murder trial in Rome was solved by the sudden discovery of an arm, or worse, in the dung heap. And yet, the Foricarii pressed on. They developed tricks, lime powder to suppress odors, padded sandals to reduce splashing, and even nose plugs of sponge or wool soaked in mint oil. Some wore wide leather hats or hoods. Others simply toughed it out, with the weary look of a man who's seen things no one should see before breakfast. Children sometimes followed them, not to help, but to gawk. Jokes were made, songs were sung. One folk rhyme from the time survives in fragment: shovel deep, shovel true, keep the emperor's seat like new. It's awful, but it rhymes. You watch the night soil man finish his load. He wipes his hands on his tunic, why bother, and pours the last bucket into a sealed clay jar. A donkey waits nearby, its cart lined with straw, to reduce sloshing. He gives the animal a pat, lights a small lantern, and disappears down the lane, bound for the outskirts. And you stand there, realizing once again that Rome, the eternal city, with its marble temples and golden domes, rested on more than politics or conquest. It rested on a vast, unsleeping engine of sanitation, of carts and pits and men like him. The parts we don't put on postcards, but perhaps we should. Because every empire has its sparkle, its triumph, its colosseums and sculptures. But what truly measures civilization? How it handles its mess. How it treats the man who cleans it up. You take one last breath of sulfur-tinged air and turn back toward the city. The Tiber murmurs beside you, and somewhere downriver another jar is emptied. The night is almost over. You're climbing again now, up the Aventine Hill where the breeze is cleaner, and the rooftops shimmer under the soft curtain of dawn. The streets here are quieter, the buildings grander, and the drains less overflowing. We're ending in the realm of the elite. Because for Rome's upper crust, sanitation wasn't just about survival, it was about status. You're stepping into a domus, a patrician household, where mosaics catch the candlelight, and the walls are painted with myths and monsters. Everything smells faintly of incense and expensive imported cedar, but you're not here for the decor. You're here to see the private toilet. Yes, wealthy Romans had them. Not just chamber pots tucked under beds, but actual indoor latrines, often tucked beside the kitchen, bath, or inner garden. Some were simple stone seats over a drain. Others, especially in villas, featured running water, tile floors, and even decorative niches. This one has a bench built into the marble wall, with a circular opening polished by generations of noble backsides. A shallow gutter runs below, connected to the house's own lead plumbing system, which may or may not be leaching toxins into their wine. But let's not ruin the moment. This toilet has a view of the atrium, a nearby water jug for rinsing, and a basket of wool cloths, clearly for wiping, perhaps even perfumed. The sponge on a stick? That's for the public. Here, it's personal, soft, luxurious. The Romans didn't have toilet paper, but wealthier homes had options: linen scraps, wool cloth, even imported moss. Some scholars believe they used rose water or oil afterward. Spa day, but for your behind. And of course, a slave cleaned it. That's the awkward truth behind elite sanitation. Convenience for some meant labor for others. For every marble-seated toilet, there was a servant scrubbing it, emptying jars, or hauling waste to the curb for collection. And yet, these elite homes weren't immune to plumbing problems. There's a letter from a wealthy Roman fuming that his bathhouse latrine has begun belching fumes, likely due to a blocked or reversed sewer line. He demands repairs. Threats are made. Slaves are blamed. The problem? Probably tree roots. Some things never change. Still, elite toilets reflected elite anxieties, not just about cleanliness, but about morality. Roman philosophers like Seneca and Pliny the Younger wrote about the virtue of modesty, even in bathroom habits. No excessive wiping, no gossip from the lavatory, no perfumes unless in case of guests. One satirical dinner party features a host who offers 5 different types of cloth for post-toilet use, each scented and color-coded. Choose based on your mood, he says. One guest takes all 5. He is not invited again. And while some elites valued privacy, others used their lavish toilets as status symbols. Archaeological digs have uncovered latrines decorated with frescoes of gods, geometric patterns, or even, bizarrely, aquatic animals. Imagine being stared at by dolphins while doing your business. One Pompeian villa had gold leaf tiles around its toilet seat. Because why not? Historians still debate whether these toilets were used daily or reserved for guests and show. In many homes, chamber pots were still the norm, and slaves would carry them away without comment. But the presence of a built-in latrine signaled something: that the owner had money, water access, and architectural pride. You linger by the door of this domus bathroom. A bird calls outside. Somewhere, a servant stirs coals for breakfast, and you realize that, just like the alley jars, the public baths, and the sponge sticks, this too is part of the Roman story, a little cleaner, a little quieter, but still very human, and not without its quirks. The poet Juvenal once sneered that Rome's rich had water that flows uphill, referring to the manipulated plumbing systems that fed their fountains and lavatories. Water was piped not by pressure, but by design, gravity, siphons, and slaves. You didn't just have running water, you had engineered water. And for a select few, that meant water that flushed. There are scattered reports of flush-like systems in elite homes, latrines where a small bucket of water was poured behind the waist to wash it into the drain. Not a true toilet as we know it, but the prototype. It wasn't common, but it happened. Rome was always experimenting. So here, at the top of the city, under rose-colored tiles and bronze fixtures, you find Rome's future, glimpses of our modern obsession with plumbing, privacy, and porcelain, but also its past. Smells, scrapes, sponges, and whispered offerings to gods below. Rome's sanitation system was layered, messy, and miraculous. It was inconsistent, often brutal, occasionally beautiful. It made the empire run not just in sewers and streams, but in habits, rituals, and the quiet labor of men you never read about. As you step out of the domus and the first light of morning warms the stone, Rome yawns awake. Bakers open shutters. A child kicks a pot down the alley. Someone sneezes. Somewhere a sponge is being rinsed. And you realize the empire wasn't built in a day, but it was flushed, rinsed, carried, stomped, and occasionally whispered into. Because in the end, every civilization has its sewer line. Rome just built theirs to last. So now, with the city behind us and the first birds calling in the fig trees, we slow our steps. The marble, the grime, the sponge, the shrine, they all begin to blur, not because they were less important, but because your eyes are heavier now. And that's okay. Let the last traces of torchlight fade behind your eyelids. Picture instead the soft ripple of water through stone channels, the low hush of sandals against polished floors, the distant laughter of someone finishing a story in the latrine. These little sounds carry more than waste. They carry the rhythm of an empire. You've walked every street, peeked behind every curtain, followed every awkward procession of jars and buckets. You've heard the curses, the jokes, the prayers whispered into sewers. You've watched a city hold itself together, not with glory and marble, but with sponge sticks, chamber pots, and the quiet grace of people just trying to stay clean. And now it's time to let it all settle. Let your mind drift through the alleys of memory, the ones without marble plaques but filled with warm torchlight and slow footfalls. Let the weight of Rome grow soft, not heavy. Let the past hum you to sleep, because for all its noise and bustle, Rome always knew how to rest. And so do you. Good night, traveler.